Hey guys, I'm Chris.
And I'm Mike.
And welcome back to this week's No Limits, the nonfiction podcast. How you doing today, Mike?
Guess we're not the thriller podcast today, although this book might as well read like a thriller. It's so damn enthralling. It's exciting.
Yeah. So I guess we should just say today we're covering our first. This is a first on No Limits thriller podcast. Our first nonfiction book, Targeted Beirut by Jack Carr and co-author James Scott. The subtitle being the 1983 bombing of the Beirut barracks.
The 1983 Marine Barracks Bombing and the Untold Origin Story of the War on Terror. Is that subtitle a little too long in the tooth? It's a little too wordy?
I mean, it's a long subtitle, but it's pretty commonplace when you're doing these kind of books. So
yeah, and I thought that's exactly what it was. The untold story. I heard so much about Beirut, particularly in this time period. And I go back to Frederick Burton. We had Fred Burton on, DSS agent, diplomatic security, had a whole career after that and all sorts of...
He's written a couple books about this, correct?
Right, and he's written a lot about Beirut, and his book, Beirut Rules, was phenomenal. We read that like 4 years ago now, though, and had him on. And I remember the bulk of that book being the embassy bombing and the kidnapping of Buckley, the station chief. And that happens, I think, a year or two after the barracks bombings. And I was wondering if Jack was going to get there. And I wasn't so sure as I was reading, because we start with the embassy bombing. And that I had known quite a bit about. I've heard, you've heard so much about that. But the scale of the Marine Barracks bombing and what those soldiers went through at the airport, it just... I wasn't sure if after we got through the embassy stuff, I was like, wow, that was intense, right? But the intensity just ratchets up, and we get this bigger global conflict with so many players and regional instability, and our Marines are plopped in the middle of it with no mission, no parameters, no definition of what success is, rules basically that they can barely defend themselves. And then, how did you not see that bombing coming? Hindsight is 2020, but it was the untold story is what I got to say. I knew it was a massive attack. I knew the Marines were there. I knew it was a debacle, but I never knew this level of detail on the incident.
Yeah. And, I guess we're pretty accustomed to the bombing of the embassy because I feel like it's mentioned a lot in the stories we cover.
Yeah.
Especially Vince. And because I feel like it was directly related to, Irene. Irene's dad, was killed in fictionally inserted into that.
Irene Kennedy of the Mitrap series.
Right.
For our non-Raps readers.
Yeah. So I feel like, and as well as other stories adjacent to the CIA, adjacent to, in this espionage thriller verse, they often cite the bombing of the embassy first. And, it's been mentioned, especially by Jack, the bombing of the Marine Corps barracks. But I didn't quite know that much about it. I thought it was one thing. And
I kind of thought that too. Yeah.
I thought it was the same thing.
One bombing. Yeah.
And then when we started the book off I was like, oh,
it happened right off the bat.
He's right off the bat. I'm like, all right, well, and then I realized, all right, I did some Googling and I was like, oh, this is a story kicking off with the Marine Corps or the embassy bombing. And it's going to take us through the next bombing and, paint us that picture. And wow, I don't know. This book was intense. I don't know if I highly recommend everyone listen to it. Ray Porter does a great job.
Phenomenal.
Of, I've tried to get into some nonfiction stuff. Obviously I was forced to read nonfiction in college, high school. Didn't quite jibe with me as well as, fictional tales do.
It's tough in an audiobook format.
Especially
you want to see the names. Yeah.
Yeah. But here it's almost, it's told very narratively.
Yeah.
It has a nice narrative while also giving us, essentially like a Wikipedia page, right? Like it's a day by day Wikipedia page, but I love the little insertions of quotes from various people,
Sure.
quotes from reporters, quotes from actual people on the ground, getting real life accounts. Essentially, while listening to Ray, I'm envisioning a documentary. Like this book read more like a screenplay for a documentary than it did like other traditional nonfiction stories, right? And Jack does obviously, and in his co-author puts in their little comments here or there, and I feel like Ray Porter does a good job of expressing some of the skepticisms, some of the introspection that they're trying to put in. But it really is just this nice documentary piece. And like I was 10 chapters in, and I was like, I got to get this for my father-in-law for Christmas. Like I ordered it immediately for him for Christmas. I'm like, he's gonna love this book.
Yeah,
because it just, while being nonfiction, it just does a great job of taking us through this real life story and really, highlighting a lot of these little things. And when I realized a couple of the characters were going to die, like it's at that moment where, oh, he's highlighting these people because they're not going to make it.
Yeah.
That hit hard for me, man.
Especially ones with unborn children.
Yeah, the doctor,
the parents, the doctor. Oh, boy, so much to say, but it is a tribute in that sense. And he says that multiple points. Like, I wanted to go into this particular attack, and in future books, it sounds like the targeted series will continue looking at other terrorist attacks.
Yeah,
and in addition,
I want the Lockerbie attack.
Oh, that would be a fantastic one. Again, Mitch Rapp series reference. Go listen to the Mitch Rapp podcast, over 100 episodes covering all those books. But I think it's a tribute in that a decision was made by the authors to make it personal. And I really like how most of the primary source material is firsthand from the families. Like, yes. It sounds like interviews, diaries, and letters, right? How many times he was able to reference and have access to the letters that a lot of these soldiers wrote home. I thought that was just a fantastic decision, because we could talk about numbers, we could talk about dates, we could have a dry historical nonfiction book, and I think that turns a lot of people away from the genre. And he decided to make it personal. I mean, I just think of that guard at the embassy who gave out the flowers.
The flowers, yeah.
And like, when the car bomb takes off, we were just with that character, right, at his guard duty, his station, and he gave a flower to one of the women working in the embassy who was coming in. Same thing with the chaplain, right? Like, so much was focused on these two chaplains and the services they were offering for the young men, and really nurturing them and trying to be spiritual fathers to them in an area and a place that wasn't hell, but you could see it. As one of the opening quotes said, Beirut wasn't hell, but you could see it. Turned out it was pretty close to hell. And like, we were really focused with these chaplains and the soldiers with families, and even the general. I feel like, what was his name, who was in charge, who got blamed in the end? Mick Garrity? Was it Garrity?
Yeah, it was some Irish name like that. Yeah. That's the downfall of audiobook, is not like
the names.
Yeah.
Garrity, Colonel Garrity.
Garrity. Yeah.
I just, you almost felt like he cared so much for the men, and he did what he could, and he made decisions he could, and he almost had this like aura about him and this presence. And then for him to get pinned by the politicians back home, and like his career completely blindsided, it was like nobody understood in Washington what the boys were going through. And I think equally, this book paints Reagan in a ambiguous or controversial light. We just had that Reagan movie come out, which there was a lot of buzz around it, but it was like, people are saying, is this going to be biased? Will this influence an election? It's a biopic. What are you talking about? Like, people can watch it if they want to watch it, and critique it if they want to critique it. But I think Reagan became a bit more controversial recently, his legacy. And I was surprised that I think Jack had opinions on his decision making. And there was even one scene, I think it was early on, when Reagan realized, he said something like, I didn't know I had that kind of power. When he got, I think it was Begin, to stop, his basically free reign in southern Lebanon on the Shia population, and just he let the Christian Druze militias go ham on them. And holy cow, the Sabra and Shatila massacres, that's been mentioned in a Jack Carr book. That was mentioned as the motivation for, I think, David, one of the early terrorists in the Mitrap series, that Palestinian weapons broker.
The series we just started.
Gray Man?
No, not the Gray Man. The other series we started. We read the first book for book club.
Daniel Silva, Kill Artist. Yeah. Oh, yeah, because he's Israeli. Exactly. So I think those were such foundational events. The massacres by the Christian militias, that was essentially given the green light by Israel, or at least Israel was hands off in trying to stop it. And I think that motivated so much of the religious strife and tensions. And we see it today. Lebanon's getting bombed by Israel in the current conflict. And then Syria's involvement too. We just, with the Syrian takedown of the Assad regime. And here we're looking at Hafez or Assad. And I had no idea how involved Syria was and why the multinational force remained and Israel refused to pull out. And if it wasn't for Assad, I feel like this thing could have wrapped up a lot earlier.
Sure.
And meanwhile, he was stoking Hezbollah and the Iranian-backed groups also. So everything, listen to the news today. You hear about Syria. You hear about Hezbollah. The Israel conflict is spilling over into Lebanon. And it has roots going back so much to what our Marines were put in the middle of. And I think that's generally misunderstood by a lot of the populace, even the people who scream over these things today. And a book like this can just fill in a lot of gaps, and those gaps really make you pause and maybe take back a lot of your assumptions about current conflicts and current events.
Yeah, and I think, the untold origin story of the war on terror, we were talking about at the beginning of the book, that's pretty apt, right?
That is the title. Yeah, it should be the title. Yeah.
It was crazy when they're referencing these names of the Hezbollah commanders, right? These two factions.
Mughniya,
Even
before that, Arafat, and how Arafat was involved initially.
And, I'm not that much of a geopolitical scholar. A lot of the stuff that I know is through reading these thrillers and then Googling on the side and, trying to confirm what's fiction, what's faction, what's not. But obviously, because I've been in this world for 5 years now, I know all these names. These are all favorite authors. Have played with them, and to see, the beginning of Hezbollah form by putting these two groups, these factions together, and enforcing them to be oh, you need to get a bigger target, and that being the Marine. This devastating attack. Yeah, and I like the sort of subtle introspection that these two authors put, like you said, with the Reagan stuff, especially most Republicans are just going to bow to the God that was Reagan, right? Yeah. And Jack obviously, aligns with a lot of what Reagan stood for, but here he's really pushing back and and there's even some comments about, when this all is happening, right? He's golfing.
Right.
At Augusta.
And that was crazy, the hostage situation.
I had no idea about that.
Can we get a book on that?
What a crazy ass day, right? You not only have, the first attack, but then you have this, the attack on Grenada. They want us to invade Grenada.
Right. Operation Fury, I want a book on too. Keep the targeteds coming. We could have 3 targeteds right there.
Just in this 3-year period. And then you have that, weird domestic terrorism, and then finalizing with this attack in Beirut. But, just and he's telling the truth, right? Or he's just, I'm assuming he's documenting things that he picked up in his research, but it just, I don't know, it shows a little bit of a weakness and how all right, none of this is going to change. He reiterates how they said every single time, this doesn't change what we're doing. The rules of engagements are staying the same.
Right.
Really?
Goalpost move, man. And you have to be able to adapt. And so much of what Jack writes in all of his forewords and preludes in all the books, those prefaces that he writes in his novels, he's always talking about adapting. And one of his big claims seems to be he feels the enemy adapts better than we do to get a tactical advantage on the battlefield, tactical and strategic advantage. And I think that's what he's always pressing in his thriller novels, that we need to learn how his characters are adapting and getting the upper hand. And I think Jack really going into nonfiction has a chance to put his stamp on it and say, like he did in his career, we have to learn lessons from history before we go downrange and send men and women downrange and into the belly of the beast. We need to learn from history, and we can't isolate that. And it almost is like a plot. And, I actually like how things escalate, not just from the embassy bombing to the main bombing, but even smaller incidents along the way. Like, it was shocking when those first 2 soldiers died. I think it was a mortar attack, if I'm not mistaken. And
then right after that, we get the 2 sniper attacks.
There's the sniper attacks too, and they're just constantly getting shot at. And then you kind of compare that to the reaction
in Washington,
in the Pentagon at Washington, and it's like, they're not being targeted. It's just, random, shells and bullets coming from the militias fighting across town. It's like, no, everyone who was there would have told you, we are being targeted. We are deliberately being shot at. We are being shelled. And we sit here like sitting ducks. We can't do anything. Yet it was more important for the establishment to go out and say, no, they're not being targeted. Like, you can't just make that up. Like, how have you not learned? Look back at the history. Basically, when they're telling you who they are, listen, they're being honest. And I went back and started it a second time. And after the embassy bombing, there's a clear statement by Islamic Jihad that says, we will fire on multinational forces. Like, we will not stop. We will come after you. If you are here, we will get you. And it's like, we knew that after the embassy bombing, that they said, it doesn't matter if you're playing peacekeeper. It doesn't matter if you say you're multinational, you're not taking sides. This is a combined effort of the Italians, the French, the Germans. They literally were telling us from the very beginning, we don't care. We will kill you. And like, if they're telling us who they are, listen. And we just can't seem to get out of our own way, or certain people with certain egos can't get out of their own way. And those people have very high positions of power to put others in harm's way. And I don't think we've learned from that yet. It sounds just like what you hear coming out of Iraq, coming out of Afghanistan with the withdrawal. We're not willing to understand who the enemy is and adapt to it, even when they show us very clearly who they are.
Yeah, and it's interesting to get some of these firsthand letters, like, and read, some of the thoughts that the boots on the ground were thinking. Like, I think there's one letter where they're like, what do people like asking, like, what do people think of what's going on over here? Essentially. Or even when the one soldier who was really close with one of the first casualties flies back and like has a conversation with either it's the family of the fallen or someone else, and like he realized that like they don't understand what's actually going on, because it's politics, right? He won an election, the election, this is 1983, right? The next election is in 1984. They're coming out of this recession that happened early on, and his approval rating, he essentially, but what's really crazy about this, right, is that the attack on the barracks is what brings up his approval rating.
Yeah.
So I was reading about like just the history of our elections and like sort of the quick breakdown of like why, like what people think. I was going back to like why Reagan won, and then so Reagan was actually trending down in his approval rating because unemployment was getting higher. It was like, approaching
the economy
almost double digits. And, he had promised this whole, like, I'm going to have a balanced budget and, help the economy and whatnot. And then his approval rating did almost a 180 after this.
It's a unifying event.
Yeah, exactly. It's 9/11, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
it's anyone that ran against George W. Bush in 2024 was going to lose because of the response to that, right?
Well, in that speech Reagan gave at the end, where everyone's congratulating him, sir, it was a great political speech. That's one for the ages. And it's like, and I understand personally, I believe Reagan, he said he prayed for those boys, every one of them, every night for the rest of his life. I'm like, sure. But it's just like, could it have been avoided? Well, like Weinberger, who was that Secretary of Defense, right. I think, was from the very beginning wanting to bring him home.
So like, and then the other like thing that's a through line throughout this entire novel, right, is this juxtaposition of should we even be there,
right,
versus should we be doing more, right? You have that other guy, Fitzgerald, right? Like the guy who.
I wish I read this book. The audiobook made it so hard to.
The way Jack like talks about this guy is like he's a he didn't go to Harvard. He like he really I was trying to understand like his spin, like whether or not he like agreed with him or didn't, or like what he was trying to do there. Yeah. And essentially, like there's this faction, right? Of you have the current Secretary of Defense doesn't even think we should be there, but you have these people underneath of him that think, we have this tool, we should be doing more. So, I don't know what the right answer is. But I definitely think either one of those answers is better than what we actually did.
Yeah.
Like we
should have put him on the boat, because that was an option.
We should have either done more
present.
or we should have pulled out. Like, if we're going to be there and we're going to tote like, oh, we are this force, just reading the scene where the truck is coming, right?
Right. Oh yeah. That was interesting.
The fact that they weren't allowed to have their guns loaded.
Yeah.
Because of the rules of engagement, right?
But that's also because, and he wrote that great scene of that sniper who shot at the two Lebanese soldiers just jogging, right? They were out jogging at the airport, right. and an American soldier shot him in the leg. And
there was a lot of things that like led up to like why that
that's
was
what
the
I was
case,
saying before,
right?
About it being like a plot. Like I know it's not a novel. It almost had these plot points that developed and crescendoed. And so when an event happened, like they couldn't stop the truck because they had no loaded weapons, that becomes this huge argument on the Hill. Any one of us, let's say at the time, is hearing this argument go on in the news, will be ramped up by it. We'll be so fired up of how could you not have bullets in the gun? Why would you not be prepared to shoot at the truck? And it's like, did you know there was the sniper incident, a friendly fire before? And did you want to be the one who had a friendly fire incident on, an ally's soldier on your own base? Like he set it up so you could see both sides.
He did a very good job of that. I will say, like, it's, I think I can glean the fact that he thinks we shouldn't have been there at all.
Right.
That's what
Or under different circumstances, like you were there and you were allowed to execute a mission. You were allowed to fight. You were allowed to do raids. You were allowed to take the offensive when the offensive was the right move to make. Instead of we're just going to sit here with no mission and there's absolutely nothing else we could do except take pot shots. And eventually those pot shots build up to, the knockout punch. And I think he would say we could have been there, but it needed to have mission parameters that were clear. And the big reason we were still there and Israel was because of Assad playing hardball. He knew he had the upper hand. So how many deaths occurred because of these power players on the chessboard realizing they have more influence and don't actually have to do anything? Others will do the dirty work and die, and all you have to say is, no, we're not going to pull out right now. And that just lets the war continue. That lets things spiral out of control. Lets these militias massacre people. It lets Hezbollah grow. And Assad is just playing the long game. It's like in Afghanistan with the Taliban, how it was, they played the long game. That line of, you have the watches, but we have the time.
Right, exactly.
You have the technology, but we've got thousands of years of history and our people ain't going anywhere. That wins every time.
Yeah, and I feel like he does a good job, or like not a good job, but he definitely puts blame on the Israelis. Like he's not shying away from the fact that they really screwed the pooch by pulling out early, or not informing. And obviously that's like some sort of retribution for whatever diplomacy we were, like there's that one quote where like allies don't handcuff allies. So like obviously, we have this interesting relationship with Israel through the years.
Sure. But Sharon, it started with Sharon being a mad dog.
Another person that we've seen in stories.
We've seen him in thriller books. I've heard his name growing up, right? It was like Begin, Sharon, all these other names of like these prime ministers and defense ministers and foreign ministers. And it's like, I've heard these names. I didn't know he was such a monster. He's made out to be a monster. The way he wants to occupy, wants to terrorize. It's the same thing with the thriller novels of like, even if you're, like we were saying with Reagan, pro-Reagan conservative, Republican conservative, that you look back on that. Well, it's the same thing of people who are like pro-Israel, love this. You do have to recognize their role in things like the Shatila massacres. Like if you don't realize that was essentially authorized or given free rein and not prevented by Israel, who was able and present and could have stopped this and didn't. If you don't realize their culpability, it's
hypocrisy.
We're just polarized. It's extreme. Exactly. We're polarized hypocrisy, and we've got to be able to see the evidence and make our own decisions. And I'm glad Jack's that way, because you follow his socials, you follow a lot of his interviews, you know which way he leans pretty much. But he also can take the evidence and take the history, learn lessons from it, and not polarize people over it.
Right.
He can have his opinions, have his bent, but it's well informed, it's factual, and there's reasons for it.
Yeah, like I don't know, I like gain more admiration for him from reading this book, like in a weird way. I already loved him, but like, some of the stuff he does is like on his podcast, on his socials, like
he's a personality.
He's a personality,
celebrity,
right?
He's a face.
And the books are secondary to that. Whereas like some of these other authors it's not the case. Like the books are what it is. He's a brand.
They don't have an empire
he's a
outside
brand
of the novels.
Yeah. So like I just, Jack Carr as the brand versus Jack Carr, the author.
Yeah. He's the first author to really go brand. Like Brad Thor kind of has that brand a little bit.
He's trying to. Yeah.
But he's trying to, but he's still all about the books.
Sure.
It's not like he sells some merchandise and stuff, but that's really only secondary to him pumping out the next book and wants his fan base to be readers through and through. Jack Carr is a fan base that goes beyond readership.
Sure. But this book has elevated Jack a little bit for me, just because of his ability to do exactly what you said. Like, give us an angle, give us a bent, give us both sides, give us truth.
Yes.
Yep. And kind of also while giving us his bent, allowing us to decide as we read and like, gain, just think about it how we want to think about it. Like, I don't know. I was not looking, no, I wouldn't say I was not looking forward. I couldn't get up to read this book, like just because I'm, it's nonfiction. It's, it's a somber story.
We sat on it for a little bit. We didn't jump right to it.
But honestly, it's one of my favorite books of the year. Like, no lie.
I want the next targeted right now. I want to hear his take on every attack. You said Lockerbie, you said Grenada, even 9/11.
9/11.
Anything.
Holy shit, the targeted 9/11 story? Like,
that would be wild. I think that would be later on. If he keeps this up, I think he's probably got a few other ones, lined up. But that one, when it comes, that will be the bombshell. That'll be like a tome. That will have to be one large story.
Be multiple volumes, like part 1, part 2, part 3.
Yeah, that's the big one.
So to me, the doc, like the two dentists.
Yeah, who was your favorite? Who was your favorite story to follow? Even if it's tragic in the end, who are you invested in?
I mean, it's probably gotta be, the doctor. And I found his name, right? He's Hudson. Lieutenant John Rice Hudson. He's this, I feel like early on, he's the one we get inside of his head the most through letters to his wife Um, and he has a newborn child. I think one on the way.
Yeah.
He's even the one who he finagles to get his some time off, and his wife and his young son come over and meet him, and he gets like a little retreat. And so, to me, he was the best, and like they're not. I don't know. I attached to him, but the chaplains also are, the one who survives.
Yeah.
Pucciarelli. No. So that's Father George Pucciarelli, and that's the rabbi.
The rabbi had a good story in the end. Yeah.
No, but is his name Harmon?
Was he the Protestant minister, the one with the family? Yeah.
He was the one who literally got like entombed in the basement, or like he was on the third floor, but then went down to the basement, and he started questioning God, and what are you gonna do? And the rabbi's actually the one who found his vestment, or his what is that called? A stole. Like, purple, like that sticks out, because in the land of camo and beiges.
Yeah, man.
And that's how they were able to get him out. And he was able to, survive and live on. So,
it was another one. And his friend came to see him, and he just needed to see the body. The guy who slept with the palm on his hand, his palm up on his hand.
Yes.
And they found him that way, and they identified him that way. I was like, oh man. And just the scenes of going through the rubble. Because there was a time when, first off, when the embassy attack went off in like chapter 2 or 3, I was like, whoa, we're doing this now. But then building up to the main barracks bombing, and that happened probably midway through chapter 20 something, maybe 30.
Halfway through the book, yeah.
And I was like, we still have 30 something chapters to go. What are we going to spend our time on? And I really like this balance of, we spend time picking through the rubble. Like,
we do.
We got the nitty gritty details. If we were talking setting for our thriller scorecard, which, folks, we're not going to do a scorecard, it's a nonfiction book, our ranking system and rating system doesn't really apply. But if we were doing setting, this is a 5 out of 5. I mean, the rubble, you could taste the dust. You could feel the weight of the cement trying to pick through it. These guys baking in the sun. I thought that was just really gripping every time they're going through the rubble, finding remains, triaging people, all the madness. But then it balanced well with some of the political stuff, the debates back with the cabinet on the home front, and eventually the post-mortem of Garrity, and is he at fault and who's at fault. And I liked how there was a little dialogue around the proceedings of interviewing guys, bringing them in and saying, what would you have done if your rifle was loaded? And one of them was like, I probably wouldn't have done anything. No way I would have gotten a shot off. How do you stop a truck? And another guy's like, I would have at least shot at him. I could have had a chance. I could have taken tires, could have, hit the driver, whatever the case may be. And it's just like so many different perspectives. And then just to say, pin it on this one guy who should have seen that coming and should have known better and put a better security perimeter and everything. Going back to Washington, then equally balancing that with the geopolitical stuff of, what's Assad doing and who's he meeting with. And I thought something crazy was I think Gemayel was the brothers, the
one who got assassinated, and then the brother got reelected. Yep.
Right. And he was like a playboy, wasn't really a good governor, a good leader. And so I thought the balancing with the Lebanese politics of it all, coming out of the Civil War and this very precarious 51% Maronite Christians, so let's give them the presidency. And then
that whole situation was like freaking like, oh, okay, like that's the U.S. fucking up, right?
Dude, you can't nation build, you can't government build if a people is that diverse, and those roots go back and they cut so deep through society and fabric of society. Maybe you need a different governing system, maybe some sort of federalized system with different groups that have their own territories and or policy making in their own regions, or some regional approach to this. And just to put the 51% group, because they're the majority. Okay, first off, in American politics even and everywhere, I think majority rules is a joke. I don't, everyone's like, oh, we win because we have more people on our side. That means 49 and even 49.5% of people lose. you need some sort of better system than just, if you get one more than the other side, you have no rights, you have no voice. It's same with people wanting to get rid of the Electoral College. It's like, so you basically want a few cities on the East and West coasts to basically determine everything for the other however many states that exist here. So like, we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to government and democracy and make everybody fit in that. And I thought nation building post an 8-year civil war that has religious strife, social strife, historical. I mean, you're literally in the Holy Land. You are in the land of the Bible, and it's like, we're thinking it has easy governmental solutions. And then you pick some guy like this Jemael playboy who just stokes fears and tensions and doesn't seem to have any sense of diplomacy at all in him. And you try to make this person the poster child. It's like in a state like Afghanistan or Iraq, when you pick somebody and this is going to be the leader. I think it was Hamid Karzai, where like, Karzai is going to be the democratically elected leader who can hold this thing together. How could you even think putting somebody in a position like that is going to work? And I thought we kept trying to do that. And I just wanted to see a change of hands in Lebanon of like, maybe this isn't the family that's kind of in bed with the Phalange and the Christian militias and the extremist groups. Maybe they're not the one to try to control the Shia population, like maybe that's the reason Hezbollah and the Iranians won't give up and will do whatever it takes to fight them off. Like, wow, what a powder keg of a situation.
Well, I mean, can you give me an instance of where America has succeeded in terms of nation building / establishment of a new regime, like where it's happened and then succeeded? I guess like Germany, like.
Yeah, but look what you had to go through to get to the Germany we have today. The Federal Republic was a long,
exactly,
a lot of steps to get there.
Exactly. So I don't know, like everywhere we've touched, pretty much, it's Korea, Vietnam, anywhere in the middle, Iraq, Afghanistan. It's
a couple of interesting nods to Vietnam here. Because like, so, if we're talking about learning
very
lessons
juxtaposition
from
of like,
yep,
what happened in Vietnam, like how we should have learned from that.
Like that was not that far removed, like we're talking early 80s in Beirut. Granted, Beirut is not Vietnam, but learning how these proxy wars and these things operate and our involvement of them in the wider context of the Cold War, you probably could have learned a lot with the pullout from Vietnam. And I guess, though, on the flip side, it could prolong the conflict of like, see, look, when we left, the communists just got everything they wanted. And here it's like, look, we pull out Syria and the Iranians and backed by the Russians get everything that they want. And Israel and us just retreat. So you could look at it both ways, right? Because we should just put the damn boys on the boat earlier, man. Just sitting on this airport.
What was really interesting to me is the comments about how no one liked Saddam. How he was like this wild card that literally no one in the Middle East liked. Like I don't know much about Iraqi history outside of like what the wars that we were involved in there, but just like the Syrians didn't like him. Lebanese, Iran didn't like him.
Well, I mean, you had Iran-Iraq war, and I think over 1 million people died in that. Like, that was one of the deadliest conflicts. So I don't think it's a lot of seeing eye to eye there. I wonder, the Saudis didn't seem too involved in this. I think they said something they were early on backing
one of the
Syria.
militias.
Or it was backing, I think it was early on, so I think it was the removal of the Palestinians. And that was interesting too, how we did have a peacekeeping force basically support the peace plan that escorted the Palestinians out of Lebanon to return to the West Bank, to return to West Bank and Gaza. And like, it was haunting when at the end of that chapter, it was like the Americans just boarded up on the boats again, left because their mission was complete. It was a very clearly defined mission parameters of, we are just simply guarding and escorting the migration of Palestinians out of Lebanon and back into the West Bank. And once that transition happened, and even Yasser Arafat was cheered, it was like he was like a celebrity to the people, and the Americans were in the thick of it. Not a shot was fired.
Right.
That chapter literally ended with the Palestinians got out. Arafat convinced them the PLO needs to get its own territory, not be, refugees in Lebanon any longer. And they departed, and the Americans assisted that. And then we left. And not a shot was fired. No one killed. And I was just like, interesting.
Yeah.
Then you put boots back on the ground in a very tenuous situation in the middle of a basically growing civil war, even if you're not calling it one. And the opposite happens.
Yeah.
No, it's completely unpeaceful.
There's a lot of juxtapositions in this book.
Yeah.
And, really
contradictions.
Teasing out what we did that worked well, what we did
like we could do
well.
it.
Yeah,
we could
exactly.
do it. And even Grenada, we've saved the hostages. We're in and out,
Mm-hmm.
A massive force was in. Did what we need to do? A massive force was out, What were we doing here?
I don't know, it all comes back to Reagan, right? For me.
Yeah.
And it really shines a light on, while in the end he ended up getting like a benefit from taking this stance, but
Right.
his inaction, his, sort of lack of understanding of how much power he actually wielded, his, there's even that one phrase where he was an appeaser, like when his advisors differed, he wouldn't like side with one or the other. He would like he would look to, he didn't like conflict. And maybe that's not the best characteristic for a leader. I think Jack does a good job of pointing that out.
Yeah. There were a few times where they were like, and the meeting concluded.
Exactly.
And everyone was hoping to leave with a clear directive and an action step. It was like everyone just said their sides, and Reagan basically said, okay, we'll think about it. Thanks for your opinion. Leadership often needs to hear from all sides.
But also pick a side.
You have to lay out a course of action. Yeah, it's like...
you can't have both sides. Yeah.
I think it was a Chesterton quote. It's something about, it's okay to be open-minded and take it all in, but your mind is more like a mouth. You could taste different things, but you eventually have to choose one you like, or your teeth have to basically close down and chomp on something. So an open mind is like an open mouth. You eventually have to close it, and you have to make your opinion and stand by it. But you should do that only after trying different things, hearing different thoughts. But you got to eventually chow down on something, get those calories. So you can have the open mind. You say, I want to hear everyone's opinion. You can bring in different voices around the table, but you also have to lay out a course of action in a meaningful time frame, because people's lives are at stake, and they were sitting ducks. This peacekeeping is so interesting. Look at UN peacekeepers. And it's funny because whenever I teach middle school social studies, and we eventually talk about peacekeepers are sent here, or this, they get this like romanticized idea of like, that's so amazing. The UN has these peacekeepers who just can go into these like conflict zones. Like, this is such a great idea. And I'm like, if only I could tell you about the corruption and the sexual abuse and the human trafficking and the amount of nonsense that goes on with these peacekeepers. And of course, I got to bounce it, and I say like, yeah, they wear bright blue helmets, right? Because they're soldiers, but they're only there to protect people. So the bright blue says, look at me, don't shoot at me. It's unlike camo where you hide out and you're trying to attack someone. That's not true. And it just doesn't work. It's just rife with corruption. So it's a great idea, but is geopolitics, can it be this pie in the sky of, could we have a peacekeeping force? It's like, unilateral versus multilateral decisions, like the coalition of the willing after 9/11, right?
It's just more indecision, right?
Yeah, or it could be. It could be very meaningful, or it could just be lip service. Yeah. Like, I guess on the war on terror more recently, thankfully we had the Brits in the beginning, and we had the Australians and, everyone else, and the French, and I guess you needed that in the beginning of it. But who's left holding the bag when we withdraw from Afghanistan?
Us.
Who's holding the bag, guarding that airport as our planes are taking off and we leave the people behind? And who's leaving their tanks and their billions and probably trillions of dollars of equipment for the Taliban to get? No one's blaming the French. No one's blaming the British. No one's blaming the Australians. So the coalition of the willing, nobody gave a fuck about when this thing is wrapping up and going too long. We're holding the bag.
Yeah.
So
it's
not to say they haven't sacrificed. I'm sure all those places sent the people, sent the personnel, sacrificed time and money. But America's got to decide what it wants to be, what it's going to be. So,
yeah, 58 French military died that day too.
Yeah, so I don't mean to downplay that at all. It's just there has to be a better solution than, look, everybody wants to do this. We'll do it together. Our Marines were trying to do it together with the French, with the Israelis, with everyone, Germans.
Yeah, but you put them over there in this impossible situation.
That's my point. That's my point, right? The war on terror is an impossible situation.
They're supposed to be there, and I don't know. It's like taking a samurai sword to I'm trying to think of a good analogy. Like taking a samurai sword to a fake fight with kids at a ball pit.
Well,
a situation where you would never be able to. All right,
you can't win.
You brought the wrong weapon, and
you can't win.
Yeah, exactly. You have the capability to win, but you can't.
Or maybe you have to win, but it's by non-conventional means, and the means of we're going to send a military might not be the only. Like there were many times in this book where it said it has to be a political answer.
Yeah.
And I don't think the Gemayel, brothers
were that answer.
Were the political answer, and if we're not addressing that, I don't know if it was Weinberg. No, who was the Secretary of
State?
Who was State? Or who was the one who met with Assad and basically just let Assad talk and just ramble, Hafez Assad, ramble, and he left saying like, oh, I think the Syrians are playing the long game. It was like, duh, what are you going to do about it? Like, how do you beat the long game? It's not by saying, let's just send all the soldiers in and let them sit there. And when we were blown away by how Assad was going to handle this meeting, it's like
Assad brings up the Bermuda Triangle, right? At the very end of a 4-hour meeting.
Tell me your thoughts on the Bermuda Triangle. And meanwhile, it's literally just stringing us along, knowing nothing's going to come out of this, and knowing he's the only person that could make Israel back off.
Sure.
And
because he knows that
he's got all the power.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's got all the power. And I don't know how our diplomatic staff didn't understand that, and how a leader like Reagan wouldn't get his people prepared for that, to go into that room, go into that meeting and play hardball, to put pressure on him. Like, you can't just go into the meeting, say, let's talk, and then not have a game plan.
Yeah, but the Syrian situation's always been interesting, right? Because they have different backers. So
yeah.
It's
a quagmire.
It's really interesting to see how this was essentially an extension of the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
With Russia, continuing on to what has just happened recently, right? With what is continuing going on with the Syrian civil war. All right, man. First,
good book.
Nonfiction book in the wraps. Good book. Highly recommend. Can't wait to see what the next targeted series is. Hopefully we're getting like one James Reese universe book a year, one targeted book a year. That'd be great.
That'd be cool. That'd be awesome. Jack's a master of all with everything he does. So I think if anybody can do it, he'd be able to do it. Pump those things out. We are getting a new James Reese book, or Tom Reese book.
Tom Reese, James Reese
in 2025. Yeah. And if you want to hear more about what we're covering here, we are going to do an end of year wrap up episode. So hopefully you'll get this out around Christmas time, and then hopefully by New Year's or shortly thereafter, we'll do a 2024 wrap up and a 2025 look ahead to what we'll be reading and what releases we're anticipating covering here on the pod for the next year.
Yep. All right. Well, we need to thank our patrons. Our Deputy Director, Sherry F., our Special Operator, Jason C., our Special Agents, Ben, Daryl, Kevin, George, Matt, Don, Peggy, and Mark. Please subscribe, rate, and review to all 3 seasons on Apple Podcast or Spotify. You can find us at thrillpod.com. And as always, just let Jack be Jack.